Okay, thank you. I'm going to start today's session. This is the third in a mini series of speakers we have in the tax policy seminar at UBC Eller School of Law. And our guest speaker is John Bistline. He's going to be talking to us about policy implications of net zero emissions. This is a paper recently published. It's a multimodal analysis of United States emissions and energy system impacts. So I want to acknowledge that this is an unusual paper to introduce into a law school setting, but I read the paper, I thought it was lovely. It was very high quality. I learned a lot from it. And it's the kind of learning that I think a lot of us in the law profession, but interested in climate policy, need to learn, at least to consume. A quick introduction to John. He is a senior program manager in the Energy Systems and Climate Analysis Group at EPRI, and EPRI is an interesting nonprofit organization. I think it's a think tank. Feel free to say a little more about EPRI, John, in the United States that offers a lot of very important policy analysis. I first learned John's name because he's appeared as the first author in a number of articles analyzing the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't know, John, how this has appeared to you, but I will say Bistline et al. There will be other professors on these papers. Some of them are economists or even law professors who we might meet more easily. For example, Kim Clausing is an example of a law scholar that I interact with at conferences frequently. But John, your name is associated with these papers because it's Bistline et al. And what I found very refreshing in 2023, reading the first paper about the Inflation Reduction Act is how thorough and rigorous it was, analyzing an extremely important policy. And that paper and subsequent papers are widely cited. And I tell my students that we wish that we had anything like that in Canada to examine. And so we did adopt policy like the Inflation Reduction Act to counter or to mirror the green subsidies offered by the IRA, but it's hard to find studies of the kind that you and your co-authors are producing. So we have until 3:30 today, and you should take your time to present your slides. We probably will ask questions at the end, but you should take time presenting. Thank you so much, John.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Wei. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, at least virtually, to present some research thinking about energy systems decarbonization and associated policy. And please feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions. Definitely want to make this as interactive as we can. And I will be sharing several studies, and I definitely want to acknowledge my many collaborators and co-authors here up front. So I'm a senior program manager in EPRI's Energy Systems, excuse me, and Climate Analysis group, where my group builds energy economic models to really understand questions about how future energy systems can be more sustainable, reliable, and affordable. Also how policy may shape those transitions. EPRI as a whole is much larger than my group. We're something like 1,400 engineers, scientists, and in my group mostly economists. And this really gives us a fuller picture of these energy system changes. And energy systems, of course, are changing on several fronts. There's greater roles for wind and solar. There's new low-emitting fuel pathways, things like hydrogen and synthetic fuels. There's also more energy storage deployment. I'm always amazed at the pace of battery storage deployment, for instance. There's also more sector coupling as well through things like end-use electrification. And that integration of systems and consequently the complexity of choices, those both require advanced models that help to reflect that changing landscape. And you don't have to understand all of the details on this diagram to appreciate how these many processes are more connected than they've been in the past, which also means that models and policy analysis are becoming more integrated and more connected too. But that doesn't mean that everything is necessarily all in one kitchen sink model, but potentially linking more specialized tools to provide insights. And so just to pick a couple examples from my group and others in terms of linking tools for policy design and decision support, one of the areas that we get asked about a lot, especially in light of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is about macroeconomic feedbacks and how tax credits and subsidies could shape things like inflation or interest rates. So my work with Catherine Wolfram and Neil Mehrotra showed that in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, even though those effects are relatively small, those macroeconomic conditions really can shape energy investments, especially since a lot of clean energy technologies are pretty capital intensive. In the middle here, we've also created sectoral models with more like microeconomic detail. Then we link those with supply side models. That's definitely given me a sense of how capturing things like differences across households, different places, different markets, how those can shape decisions. So electric vehicle uptake can look pretty different if you drive a car a lot versus having a low mileage vehicle. And then over here on the right in the top, affordability and equity analysis have been focal for a lot of policymakers. And this type of work, both my group has done and others, compare really detailed energy system models with micro simulations or even higher level general equilibrium effects. So ultimately, this type of detail here is important for three reasons. One is to better capture the underlying dynamics, and I'll say a bit about that on the next slide. The second is to really answer questions that decision makers have. So information is only valuable if it's going to change your decision. So I found that working with state, federal policymakers and working with industry and others, sometimes you need this extra detail in the modeling in order to answer the questions that people have. And then finally, another function here is to integrate knowledge across a range of domains. I think one thing that's really fun about working at EPRI with so many engineers who specialize in everything from specific types of heat pumps all the way to supply side technologies is that the modeling, the type that my group does, is able to integrate that sort of domain expertise and subject matter expertise into one consistent system to help to look at some of these broader systems level questions. Skipped a couple too many slides here. Hang on. So of course, models are simplified pictures of those really complex systems, and to help understand the systems better, you're inevitably going to be making simplifying assumptions. And there's a trade-off here between how to balance that complexity and the parsimony. And I think everyone likes to quote George Box that all models are wrong, but some are useful. But he has another quote about how the practical question is how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? And I really like this diagram, which illustrates how even though model complexity lowers, call it inadequacy error, which is the red line here moving to the right, it also increases calling propagation error. So models that have more parameters, more inputs, have more uncertainty with each one of them. And those mean that in total you have model error here is in green is kind of a U shape in complexity. So more complex models aren't necessarily better, especially if going to the right, you're also taking more computational resources, more time to run the model. Not to mention the communication issues that after you run a big study, a big analysis, policymakers are looking for a one-handed economist sometimes, not looking for all of the nuance. So all of those factors, do suggest though that there's a sweet spot in terms of the degree of complexity for a given application. And that can look different if you're evaluating a power sector regulation versus an economy-wide emissions policy versus making an investment decision if you're a company. And although complex models aren't always better, that detail can be valuable, again, both for accuracy and to make insights more actionable. And I've done, pretty wide range of policy analysis, especially in the power sector, where the extent and the resolution of the models can be, I'll say, first order drivers of outputs. And so the panels here show how there are different types of tools that vary based on their temporal, spatial, and sectoral detail. And here there's often a trade-off between the extent of what's modeled and the detail of that representation. And that's reflected in the fact that each one of these panels is downward sloping. And so for each, studies can have materially different conclusions depending on the details of the model and then how it's applied, including how things like temporal resolution can affect Inflation Reduction Act investments, and how spatial resolution could affect emissions leakage for a policy, or how sector coupling may change analysis of, say, clean hydrogen incentives. So just to add a little bit more detail, for the leftmost panel on temporal resolution, where you have the horizontal axis is temporal resolution, where dispatch might take place either at a sub-hourly level, hourly, or daily, or it might just be seasonal or annual. And then the temporal extent here is on the vertical axis. So the model may be focusing on dispatching a system over a course of a few days or weeks, or you might be looking at models of investment that take place over the course of decades. And so my work in the past has shown how that temporal resolution on the horizontal axis can really alter the decarbonization pathways that are pursued, including the portfolio of energy storage and renewables and dispatchable jet generation. So I guess a loose analogy I like to use here is that the models of the sort that I use and apply are kind of like painting, right? I've always enjoyed this quote here by Francis Bacon, the 20th century painter, not the philosopher, that Van Gogh speaks of the need to make changes in reality which become lies that are truer than the literal truth. This is the only possible way the painter can bring back the intensity of the reality which he's trying to capture. I believe that reality in art is something profoundly artificial and that it has to be recreated. Otherwise, it will just be an illustration of something. So, I would say this mirrors the move in painting from realism to abstraction, especially after the advent of photography. And just as an example, here's a painting by the Spanish painter Diego Velázquez. This is from the 1600s. Even Baroque painters make choices about composition and framing, but overall this is a fairly realistic portrait. But in contrast, the Bacon interpretation of the same subject here on the right is more abstract, more nightmarish. I don't know if Bacon would have been a good energy modeler in another life, but that same sort of process of lying to reveal the truth is the same process as mathematical modeling, right? Where you take a complex system, you simplify it, and then use the model to learn something more about the system. So all of that is, kind of preface the work that I'm going to summarize. And for the remainder of my talk, I want to provide an overview of the kind of frontier of policy analysis and decarbonization modeling. And most of this is filtered through my work in the US. But I would say that many of these challenges are global ones. I know Canada wrestles with some of these same issues. And so I think, as most folks know here, most countries, or many countries, subnational jurisdictions and companies are talking about net zero emissions targets. These are often somewhere around mid-century. But these would be a pretty large acceleration in a lot of countries or companies relative to the pace of emissions reductions in recent years. And this slide is showing an example for the US, where economy-wide emissions are down almost 20% from 2005 levels until today. But progress, at least in the US, has come mostly from the power sector, which is in the bottom in purple. But if you look out to 2050, a net zero target implies roughly a 3 times faster pace relative to historical levels. So going from about 3 percentage points a year compared to 1 percentage point historically. I think the one thing that I like to point out here is that even though 2050 and targets then seem like they're a long way away, we're actually closer to 2050 than we are to 1990, which is where the emissions series here begins. So basically, we're closer to 2050 now than we are to the release of Titanic back in 1997, which is pretty hard to believe. But I got my PhD just after the emissions peak here, and it's incredible to see how much in the energy landscape has changed since then. But there's a few questions that I'll try to answer during today's discussion. The first is, how could electrification and these other trends, how could that alter load growth? The second is, what's the role of natural gas in the energy system decarbonization? I know gas is an important resource for a lot of countries in both Canada and the US, are producers of gas. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I also want to talk about how regional factors can shape investments. That's something that I get a lot of questions about, especially when you're thinking about these policy impacts. And then the final one is, how do policy design and availability of technologies influence these insights? So my talk, as I mentioned, is drawing from a few studies, but they're mostly multi-model studies. And I like multi-model studies because they help to highlight robust findings, as well as uncertainties or disagreements across models and across different scenarios. And this is analogous to storm tracks for hurricanes, which unfortunately is very timely this week. But here you can see several models. This is of Hurricane Katrina, 5 days before landfall on the left, where the storm path was pretty uncertain 5 days in advance. And then the day before landfall on the right, where the storm path through New Orleans was largely clear. And like storm tracks, multi-model studies can give decision makers valuable information on future uncertainties. But I think a key difference to point out here is that modeling studies aren't intended as forecasts, right? It's often said that primary goal of policy modeling of the sort that I do is for insights that the models provide, and not for the precise numbers. Even though I'm hearing from a lot of policymakers, a lot of decision makers, that they are interested in those very specific numbers, specific quantities. So there's 4 themes I hope to cover in my talk, which I've divided into consensus takeaways on the top and areas with more uncertainty on the bottom. The first is that electrification is expected to play a large role in reducing emissions across the economy. So in the decarbonization merit order, it's one of the first things that's generally deployed. But at the same time, there's controversy about the extent of load growth, especially with these simultaneous trends like data center proliferation. There's questions about load profiles, like how the hour-to-hour changes may evolve over time. And then also electrification rates across different sectors and across different regions. The second takeaway is that a decarbonizing world can potentially retain a role for gas. So gas capacity turns out to be important in the power sector, even if capacity factors, so the use of those power plants, declines with deeper decarbonization. Gas potentially could be used to support costly to electrify end uses as well. So I'll mention high temperature industrial processes as one area. But there's also questions or uncertainties here at the bottom of the slide about the extent of that gas use, as well as infrastructure needs, and also these other low carbon fuels, things like hydrogen or other so-called e-fuels. So the third takeaway here, this one should probably come as no surprise, that solar and wind are expected to play large roles in many future systems. But here there's more uncertainty about the extent of adoption, the regional mixes of those two, as well as reliability impacts and the deployment of balancing resources, like the extent of storage. This is an area, I would say, where there's some popular narratives that may look different from more nuanced look at the literature and also real-world experience. And then finally, policy design has first-order impacts on investment, emissions, and costs. And even though there's, of course, a lot of uncertainty about the eventual form that those might take, the policy design issues are really pervasive, even if you have a sense for the overall stringency of a goal. There's a lot of potential implications for affordability, for fiscal costs that we'll talk about later on. So that's an overview of what I hope to cover during our hour and a half together. But I want to start here with electrification's role, and I definitely want to address the sort of 800-pound gorilla of data center load growth just right out of the gate here. Because almost every conversation about energy these days seems to drift into speculation about data center driven growth. And on one hand, I think that makes sense, given both the potentially large impacts of AI, but also because data center loads have roughly doubled since 2019, as we see here. This is a figure from EPRI's white paper last year, and the QR code should link you to the white paper to learn more, but I'll also have links at the end of my slides today. And there's of course a lot of uncertainty about projections for service demand and the consequential electricity use, not to mention estimates. Current use varies by almost a factor of 2, at least in the US. So it's not implausible to consider that loads might be 3 to 4 times higher early in the 2030s. But to some degree, efficiency could also offset some of this growth, as it did in the past during the 2010s. We have an update of this white paper coming out soon, which does shift many of these curves up a bit, at least for the US. But of course, data centers aren't the only source of load growth. This figure is showing projections from our regen energy systems model, which is EPRI's in-house model. And this puts data center loads in dark blue in the context both of transport electrification, which is shown here in green, as well as some electrolytic hydrogen in pink. And then at the bottom in gray is sort of the existing loads from buildings and industry. And this is for a reference case through 2035. And this is faster electricity growth than in recent history, especially since, at least in the US, growth sort of plateaued around 2010. But at the same time, we've navigated even larger growth historically in the past, especially in percentage terms. So I would say there's no need to panic, but there's definitely a need to plan. And planning potentially can leverage growth in these emerging sectors like AI demand, while scaling innovation in others, especially clean energy deployment. But this is good practice, since even higher load is expected as we look out after 2030, especially with deeper economy-wide decarbonization. And so the ranges here on the right through 2050 show results basically from a database of US modeling studies that we published in Joule last year. And you can see the bars on the right in 2040 and 2050 definitely go up, but they also have quite a wide range of outcomes, especially when you're hitting economy-wide net zero levels. And uncertainty in electricity demand does increase as you're moving out in time, which depends on factors like how much electrolytic hydrogen might be produced and the degree of end-use electrification. So it's conceivable that demand could be, something like double, triple today's levels by 2050. But if you have offsetting efficiency and maybe less use of electrolytic hydrogen, demand may only be, 50% higher or so. So on that front, electricity's future role has extended to more segments than it did even a decade ago, including transportation, which is shown here in the first panel, and this comes from this EMF 37 study. And so transport, isn't just light duty cars, but also electrification is expected for trucks, medium and heavy duty vehicles. Industrial demands are shown here in the second panel, and then buildings is in the third. And again, these are from the Energy Modeling Forum 37 paper, which was the first multi-model study to look at net zero economy-wide emissions by 2050. And we can see how buildings here on the right in blue are already highly electrified, whereas transport, is accelerating basically from zero to today. It's mostly petroleum, but over time you can see that many of the models project a pretty substantial increase in electrification. But there are a lot of differences across models that I find really striking here. In some models in industry, there's pretty extensive electrification, and also the use of low carbon biofuels in green, as well as hydrogen in pink. Whereas other models use quite a bit of petroleum and gas, and then use carbon removal to offset those. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think this type of figure raises several questions. One is, with all of this additional demand, what do those hourly load profiles look like, especially for more novel loads, things like electrolytic hydrogen, vehicle charging, as well as direct air capture. And that raises questions about how could rate design be used to help unlock that flexibility. A lot of places around the world are thinking about ways of providing price signals to consumers to better reflect system costs and allow them to be participants in the market in some form or another. There's also questions about how climate change would impact the electrification of these different end uses. Also, really in the weeds questions about transmission and distribution impacts that are really critically important on the ground, especially as you're thinking about these policies that encourage the adoption of electric technologies. So one of the questions I often get is are we on track to reach these electrification rates? And this figure shows recent US trends at a state level, where each panel is one of the 50 US states, for electric vehicles in dark gray, and then heat pumps in orange. And these are in terms of annual retail investments, like per capita, and they go from 2018 through 2023. And that saying about the future is here but not evenly distributed definitely applies to electrification. So EV deployment is highest in the West and the East in the US. So last year, California, and I think also the state of Washington, something like 1 of 4 vehicles sold was a car with a plug. But there's also pretty high adoption in other states as well, anywhere from Oklahoma to Kansas to Colorado, and then states along the eastern US. Heat pump sales, on the other hand, have historically been strong in the South, but over the last few years, we haven't seen a lot of growth, even with Inflation Reduction Act incentives. These tick up a little bit, but not by nearly as much as EV sales have changed. But I think speaking of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think one challenge for increasing electrification rates was that knowledge about IRA's incentives has been pretty low among the public. It was really striking for me to read some of these public poll results that suggested that something like only 10% of Americans who called climate change very important to them had heard a lot about IRA.
John, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
A very ignorant question, but that's the kind of person I am when it comes to this. Heat pumps are electricity intensive. Is that why you're featuring this? And so in the South, if we want to use heat pumps as efficient uh, coolants, air conditioners, we need a lot of electricity. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and heat pumps could be dual use, or often are dual use for both, heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. But yes, they're primarily electricity, but the backup fuel can vary. So depending on your climate and how cold it gets in the winter time, you can have a heat pump and then a backup gas furnace, for instance. Because the heat pump's efficiency really declines, or electricity use really goes up as you get to colder and colder temperatures. And heat pump technologies, as my colleagues would describe, have improved quite a bit in the last several years. But generally, you still have a backup system. It might be electric resistance, which still uses electricity, but is more efficient in those colder temperatures. But yeah, so that's one reason to focus on heat pumps, is that they do consume electricity.
So in the southern states, the heat pumps, the orange you're showing, is that for warming, heating, or for cooling?
Yeah, so they're used for both, but of course in the southern U.S., given its hot climate, the number of hours a year that you're heating, may not be a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, it also, I mean, like an air conditioner, it also helps with humidity. But yeah, heat pumps, the trade-off is often between, gas furnaces versus, electric heat pumps. And there are some places in the South that, don't have a gas hookup. So in those places, either a heat pump or an electric resistance heater might be used.
Thank you.
So final point on electrification here is that end-use electrification can potentially help lower household energy spending as well. Affordability seems to be the new buzzword, at least in the US. And this figure shows annual household, we're calling it energy wallet spending, which is expenditures on electricity, gas, and other fuels. And this figure showing 2024 shares. And across the 50 US states, there's quite a few differences in composition. But for almost all of them, half of the annual spending is on gasoline. So that's in the kind of purplish color here on the left. But if you look at the US average, it's something like 5,500 US dollars a year is what the average household spends. But some households spend a lot more, especially in the northeastern US. There, the prices are higher, and also total energy use is higher. A place like California is a little bit higher than the national average. The prices are high, but the energy use is lower than average. And then places like Utah in the US have both low consumption, low prices. But that's 2024. If we look ahead to 2050, this is a scenario with current policies. Many of these hexagons get smaller, basically. So overall spending is declining. And the story here is that technology change, especially electric vehicle adoption, potentially can reduce household energy expenses. With these scenarios, it's something like 36 to 42% by 2050. And that's even the scenario that assumes higher prices. But basically, households that are adopting electric vehicles, the share of their overall expenses that come from electricity goes up, but that's displacing gasoline purchases, which again is the over half of spending for many households now. And if you're interested in checking out more of our energy wallet analysis, we have some cool interactive maps. I definitely encourage you to check out our website there. And maybe this is a good place to pause and see if there are any questions on this first point about the role of electrification.
Yeah, we did have one hand raised. Sorry.
How the annual solar expenses are calculated? Is it a fixed cost or a?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, solar here is rooftop solar, and so yeah, this is an annualized calculation to look at the initial cost of the panels. Obviously, you're saving on your electricity bill, but yeah, this is kind of annualized capital cost there. Great. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Going to the second point is that a decarbonizing world potentially can have a significant role for gas. These aren't necessarily inconsistent with each other and isn't necessarily in conflict with the trend of electrification that we just discussed. But as I alluded to in my overview slide, there's sort of two important roles or potentially important roles for gas in a decarbonizing world. The first is providing firm capacity and potentially generation for electricity. And the second is supporting those costly to electrify end uses in industry and in buildings. And having economy-wide net zero targets, doesn't necessarily imply a fossil fuel phase out. And so these plots, again, are coming from the EMF 37 study, where sort of current policies reference is on the top, and the net zero by 2050 case is on the bottom. And so, with current policies, trends vary a lot by fuel and across models. Coal is continuing its historical declines. These potentially could be even steeper with their power plant rules the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency had promulgated that have since been repealed. But regardless, the coal trend is downward. It's just a question of how fast. Petroleum here in the middle in gray is actually dropping because of transport electrification across many models. But there is quite a bit of uncertainty in the extent. So that's why you see that the kind of range across models is pretty big over time. But then gas use here on the right is actually increasing with current policies, and the median scenario is increasing about 20% by 2050 compared to today. But if we look at a net zero world now, so gas is much, I would say more viable than coal or petroleum under a sort of decarbonizing system. And even though gas is declining across many models with net zero now, the median reductions are only about 24% by 2050 compared to 59% for petroleum and almost 90% here for coal. And I think these results really highlight how having a net zero target can really reshape consumption of fossil fuels. The production, of course, is a related but separate issue. If you're sort of have export markets the way that Canada or the US does, that does depend on those sort of global dynamics. But yeah, maybe to dig one level deeper, which sectors could use that gas in the future? Which ones find it valuable to keep around even with deeper decarbonization? And so both the composition of gas use and the extent varies a lot depending on which policy design is assumed and which sector you're looking at. And so this figure is based on, this is just an EPRI analysis and a regen model that looks at a reference scenario and then several net zero scenarios with different technology sensitivities, an optimistic net zero reference, and then a net zero limited option, which doesn't allow CCS. And for the electric sector, which is the 5 bars here on the left, that sort of net zero flexibility, maybe it enables gas to potentially have a role in meeting those targets. But you notice that a lot of it is with CCS. There's a lot of uncertainty about the cost and availability of carbon capture and sequestration, uncertainty about all of those points in the process, both capturing the carbon, then sort of transport and storage of it. But our reference technology assumptions and cost assumptions suggest that there might be a considerable role there. But gas use drops pretty considerably on either side there, where you have more optimistic assumptions about renewables and energy storage, which is this third bar here. And then the fifth bar, when you don't have CCS available, gas use also plummets. In industry and then in buildings, a couple of things really jump out here. So gas use in industry is roughly a third smaller with net zero goals compared to sort of current policies reference. And that's basically a story of those high temperature processes being more costly to electrify. And this option of keeping gas in the mix, though, is really predicated on the availability of carbon removal options or carbon removal technologies. So those are things like biomass paired with carbon capture that have a negative emissions flow. Direct air capture makes a lot of headlines whenever projects come online. That's pulling carbon out of ambient air, which is hard technologically, right? Because it's at such low concentrations. So that's very costly on a ton per CO2 basis right now, but there's uncertainty about how that could evolve. Then there's also, kind of old-fashioned afforestation, right? And other approaches like, biochar that can help to, again, lower atmospheric concentrations of CO2.
John, can I ask a question? I'm just trying to understand these charts. So CCS features prominently under the electricity panel. And what does it mean to plot this high bar with CCS along the pipeline gas composition axis? And note for the industry and building panel, CCS doesn't feature, and there's a lot of fossil fuel. Can you just explain the reasoning here? One would have thought that if you consume a lot of fossil fuel, you need a lot of carbon storage sequestration to counter that. So why is it that this is showing up in electricity but not under industry and buildings?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the applicability of carbon capture, the power sector is one where you can basically use carbon capture directly. With gas and industry and buildings, it's not as feasible. But
I see. Okay.
There you're basically using carbon capture elsewhere in the system, and then sort of using that to offset the fossil fuel use with unabated gas. But another option is that there are ways of producing synthetic natural gas or renewable natural gas. They're technically both biomass feedstocks, or you could use hydrogen, and that's in green here. So in these scenarios that basically say you can't use either carbon capture or carbon removal, that's where these kind of synthetic hydrocarbons potentially can play a larger role, and that's why you see these green bars being used in the kind of extreme limited technology net zero.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's infeasible technologically for industry and building emitters to use CCS, but it's feasible for electricity generation. So how does one interpret the magnitude of the bar under the NZ references? And so there will be fairly small amount of fossil fuel. And then what is the CCS capture? It means the amount of fossil fuel emissions that is going to be in turn captured by CCS?
Yeah, that's right. So in the system so the power sector has a combination of gas plants with CCS and without. And this suggests that the plants without capture, they run a small percentage of the time, whereas a lot of the generation that's coming from gas-fired units is ones with CCS. Yeah, I think that's probably the right way of interpreting this one.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this slide, providing a little bit more detail on gas use and electrification in buildings. So this slide is a more granular view of space heating in particular. And this is showing heating technology by floor space. So gas, if you look, currently in the U.S., in orange, gas accounted for almost 2/3 of heated floor space in the U.S. Whereas electric on the top, a lot of this was in light blue electric resistance, so not heat pumps, but other just resistance heating, which is less efficient overall. And these are again national results. There's a regional story underneath this. But if we look at the scenarios on the right, this is 3 varieties again of net zero. We can see that in our regen modeling, we do see a lot of heat pump adoption with those net zero targets. Now, the air source heat pump, without a backup, is in darker blue. Heat pumps with an electric backup is this hatched area here. There's some heat pumps that have gas backup, as I alluded to earlier. That might be better suited for climates that have cheaper gas or have colder climates. But there's still some gas use in buildings here as well, especially with turnover times, as well as other regional considerations. You still have some of that. It's not until you add on additional side constraints and targets for electric mandates for both new buildings and then existing buildings that you get close to 100% building electrification. So I know that one of the slogans is often electrify everything, but at least in our modeling, we see that even in these areas like buildings that are highly electrified already, you're not completely electrifying everything, even with these deep decarbonization targets. All right. So, although a major end use for gas is the power sector, I think the third point of agreement across models is the large scale of deployment of wind and solar. So, how can these both be true? So this slide is showing results, again, from multi-model study that I led. This one was the 2023 study that Wei alluded to, looking at the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's showing historical capacity additions on the left. And then on the next slide, I'll show the average rate of builds under these IRA scenarios. And on the left here, we can see the large boom in gas builds in orange back in the early 2000s. But then renewables are becoming a bigger part of the story with wind in green, solar in yellow as we're getting closer in time. And we also see energy storage going from almost nothing to much higher deployment now. But these build rates could accelerate quite a bit moving forward. And so I'm adding bars now to the right that show the average build rate across models over the next decade. And I have a set of bars with Inflation Reduction Act incentives, and then a set of bars just with investments before incorporating those subsidies. And so, I think a couple of things really stand out with this figure. One is that all scenarios are really seeing accelerated builds of wind in green and solar in yellow. Even compared to recent records in the last several years. But I think the other thing that's striking, though, is that there's a lot of differences across models too in the extent of wind and solar additions. Some models are sort of on the higher end of historical values, whereas others are sort of 2 to 3 times higher than the record levels that were set last year. And I think this really, highlights how there's, a lot of uncertainty about impacts of things like permitting and local opposition and interconnection, but also more fundamental in the ways that models sometimes have a lot of detail that can help to characterize the value of, say, energy storage in purple, whereas other models are, more aggregate in their representation of storage. I think the other thing that jumps out is that in orange, the extent of new gas additions is pretty different across models. Some models suggest that there's not a lot of gas being added, whereas others, have pretty considerable gas additions. And in part, that reflects these sort of different projections for the extent of load growth. And even since we did, this analysis in 2023, expectations for load growth over the next decade have, really increased in most regions around the U.S.
John, a quick question on this graph again. What does it mean for gas, the gas bar to be showing up both above and below the zero line? If the axis is capacity change, why is it increasing and decreasing? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. I skipped over the retirements at the bottom. Obviously, coal and blue.
Retirement. Okay.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of retirements there. But yeah, gas, you're absolutely right. So there's some additions and some retirements, and there's sort of two things at play. One is that this is the national level. At a regional level, depending on where load growth is happening and the sort of age of the existing fleet, you may have additions in one place and retirements in another. And also the gas composition is a little bit different. So there are, combined cycle gas units, which are bigger, more efficient, they run a lot. A lot of the new builds tend to be combined cycles, whereas a lot of the retirements are kind of simple cycle gas turbines that are less efficient, more polluting, but you don't really run them all that often. So that, yeah, basically that's why you have additions and retirements happening.
Thank you.
So, I've mostly shown national level results here so far, but it's really important to remember that at a regional level, the capacity mixes differ a lot. That's both true today, and if we look out in the future in 2050. And this is probably an obvious point to this audience, but I'm often surprised how that regional story often can be glossed over. And this figure shows capacity from, again, this is a regen net zero scenario. And I'm using the same color scheme. And if you just look at, wind in the Midwest in green, and solar here in yellow in the West, that mix varies quite a bit depending on where the resource is best. So in the US, it's like Midwest. In the South, here in Texas, have good wind, whereas the solar resource is really good here in the West. So regions like the eastern US, where the wind resource is not as good, and even in the South, those are places where you have more gas with CCS. The cost of gas is also relevant there. But if you think about balancing a system with pretty high deployment of variable renewables, that balancing mix varies a lot by region. So places that have a lot of solar tend to have a lot of storage. Those tend to be complementary. But even in places like the Midwest that have a lot of wind still have a lot of storage, and then the gas without CCS that, as we alluded to earlier, maybe doesn't run as often, but doesn't have that extra cost that CCS adds. So that was kind of technology, like the reference technology. If we have a limited options scenario, which was one of the bars we saw earlier. Now reaching net zero emissions becomes harder and more expensive. And this, again, is a scenario that constrains CCS and also constrains biomass availability, not just in the power sector, but in other sectors as well. And there's, these pies get larger, which reflects more load in most regions. And that's partially from using more electrolytic hydrogen, right? So you're using electricity to produce hydrogen that can be used in industry and for long distance transport, basically those costly to electrify applications. So yeah, without CCS, a lot of these pies are getting bigger. There's often 2 to 2.5 times the capacity investment in regions. That also changes the incentives for transmission expansion as well. And those are the blue bars here. you can see, really getting larger. So basically, as you have these hourly supply and demand imbalances, that creates greater incentive to build interregional transmission. These questions about low carbon infrastructure and some of the really difficult challenges in paying for and siting that infrastructure, definitely come up when you're thinking about these systems and policies that really incentivize, especially variable renewables and energy storage of different types. Maybe I'll pause here before we talk about policy, see if there are any questions on wind and solar here.
Yeah, there's a question, Oliver, please.
Could you explain again the difference between the gas and the gas CCS when it appears in these? I don't understand. What the difference is there.
Yeah, great question. So in this slide, or this scenario, by construction, there's no CCS. So all of the orange is gas without CCS. I mean, for the most part, with this scenario, because you're so constrained on carbon removal, that capacity isn't used like very much at all. Whereas in this scenario, this is the all options scenario that does include the possibility of adding CCS. So the lighter orange is gas with CCS, the darker orange is without. And so many regions have both, and the split depends on how often you're running that capacity, right? So if it is economic to run some units a lot, then generally it makes sense to add CCS. Whereas some of this capacity, you may only be running it 10% of hours, right? And so that high upfront capital cost of adding carbon capture may not make sense. So in some regions, picking this one in particular, the Midwest, it's all gas without carbon capture. So in terms of reaching net zero emissions across the economy, that means that in that region, however often you're using gas, you would need to purchase an offset from somewhere else. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Kind of different roles in these different scenarios.
And that's because the region is forecasted to be. It's forecasted that that region will just not be the best. It won't be efficient to use carbon capture and storage there.
Yeah, and I guess here, one big factor is that when you look at the costs of the storage part, so we have spatially resolved modeling to look at how costly is it to build a CO2 pipeline to store it underground, and the resources aren't as good there. But if you move over even just to the Ohio Valley area and Illinois, where Chicago is, there are more opportunities there for storage. So yeah, that's another element or another area of complexity with a lot of these scenarios.
Thanks.
So maybe that's a good segue to the fourth point here, is that policy design really shapes energy system outcomes. And again, that might seem obvious, but I think some analyses may gloss over the details there, but that affects a lot of metrics that people care about. And this slide is showing results from the NBER paper that I co-authored with Catherine Wolfram, Jim Stock, Kim Clausing, and Neil Narotra. And this work is thinking about trade-offs between many near-term climate policy options, and is looking at those across a range of policy outcomes. So here, the policy outcomes are economy-wide CO2 emissions in the first column, the fiscal costs and revenues to the government are the second and the third columns, and then the average abatement costs, so the dollars per ton of CO2 reduced, is the final column here on the right. And so we ran scenarios that range from a kind of current policies reference to different variations of repealing IRA or expanding the Inflation Reduction Act, or supplementing it with things like a clean electricity standard or a carbon fee or carbon tax at the bottom. And so, this wide range of scenarios allows us to understand trade-offs, especially in an environment where, with this past year in 2025, there were, fiscal pressures, let's say in the U.S., with the extension of this so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So that's where we did the analysis in 2024. We were trying to think through some of those trade-offs. And I think those what-if scenarios are really good at providing insights about the relative magnitudes of change here and maybe highlight some of those system interactions. And maybe just as an example here, it's maybe intuitive that there's a tension between emissions reductions and fiscal costs, right? So if you remove the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, that leads to the lowest fiscal costs, right? $70 billion in nominal terms, but it also has the highest emissions, right? So one less obvious thing, though, is that even though adding a carbon fee to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is this row right here, it increases the outlays under the Inflation Reduction Act, so the cost of the government. It's over $2 trillion over the course of the next decade. But it also encourages the use of subsidized resources here, and so it brings in it also brings in revenues, right, from the carbon fee. So yeah, the average abatement costs, if we go to the far right column here, vary by quite a bit, right? IRA without EPA rules is something like $43 per ton of CO2. Or sorry, $69. If you add those rules, it's $43. Basically, those EPA rules help to reduce coal, which is pretty cost effective in terms of dollars per ton of CO2. But the lowest costs tend to be these cases that like pair carbon fees, carbon taxes with IRA, or a partial repeal of IRA, $25 or $18. We can also, look at costs to households as well. We looked at that here. Although you may think that households would be spending less on energy if you have an IRA repeal scenario compared to one that has carbon fee plus IRA, but you would be wrong. At least for this, sort of modest carbon fee that we looked at here, and also retail gasoline carve out. So the average household basically benefits from those subsidized resources with the Inflation Reduction Act that lower electricity costs. Anyway, so that's kind of in the weeds with this study.
But John, can we just look at that table for longer? But I think from a tax policy perspective, because this is the tax policy page, basically, we're looking at these options. I have some questions, but if we could just start by going through the different rows, can you just say more about how reference is defined and what is the EPA rules that can be taken out from reference, what IRA expansion means, and what partial IRA means?
Yeah, it's great question. So reference is, it was current policies as of 2024 that includes US state policies, as well as the federal subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. So that gets you to about 50% declines in emissions in 2035 from 2005 levels, compared to about 20% today, as I mentioned earlier.
So reference actually includes the IRA.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
In 2024, it included IRA.
Okay.
The reference without EPA rules removes those EPA power plant performance standards. That was the ones that I alluded to that affect coal and gas to some degree. The IRA repeal then removes Inflation Reduction Act incentives starting in 2026. IRA expansion, this is mostly expanding the power sector tax credits. It's basically increasing the magnitudes of those by 50%. So the dollar per megawatt hour that you would receive from a production tax credit, doing 50% more in that case. The carbon fee scenario is like modest and then increases over time. I think that begins at like $10 a ton of CO2 in 2026, and then increases by like $5 a year for the first several years.
So this is a really interesting role because the carbon fee is going to raise 590 billion of revenue. However, the net fiscal cost is going to be 2 trillion over a year. It's almost as large as any other road. So is this saying that because you're imposing a carbon fee, you're making the green investments even more profitable, and therefore there's going to be far larger handouts under the IRA, and that's why you have a net fiscal cost of 2 trillion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the carbon fee, makes fossil fuels more expensive, which increases the attractiveness of those clean resources that are subsidized under IRA, which is, exactly as you described. It means that the fiscal costs increase, even though you are getting, some of these offsetting revenues from the carbon fee. And the big difference between this row, and maybe we'll ignore the clean electricity standard for now, the bottom row, the carbon fee plus partial IRA repeal, that we viewed as kind of maybe a compromise. If you had, 2024 elections had turned out differently, and you had, Republican and Democratic controls of, the White House and like the House and Senate. And so there, we have the same carbon fee as before, but now it's repealing some of the more contentious aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act, including the electric vehicle subsidy. That's one that we found had a pretty high fiscal costs, but at the same time, because electric vehicles, already can be cost effective for a lot of households, you would be having a lot of, inframarginal, subsidizing those inframarginal purchasers. And there's a great Han Alcott et al. Paper that, really digs deep into that question about, how many people buying EVs would be inframarginal and doing it anyway, even without a subsidy. And they find, somewhere between 2/3 and 70-something% of those credits would go to households that would have purchased an EV anyway. So the goal there with the carbon fee with partial IRA repeal is to retain those elements of IRA that are most cost effective, and then add to it a carbon fee that's modest, right? Still the same one as this other one.
Yeah, this is really interesting. One interpretation is that when you have giant green subsidies in place and you put a carbon fee on top, that actually triggers a lot of distortions. You make the green subsidies even more distortionary.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And some of these feedbacks can be pretty complex and interesting. One in particular here is that IRA had these clean hydrogen tax credits, and there it was very, very generous for electrolytic hydrogen. So again, using electricity to make hydrogen. And those were so generous that potentially that becomes a really large source of electricity demand. And if that electricity is subsidized through the production investment tax credits, there were cases where you were just producing a lot of hydrogen to collect the credits, but you're not really displacing a lot of emissions with that hydrogen. So at any rate, we have a white paper on that back whenever that hydrogen tax credit was being debated, that thought through design decisions. So I guess one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that there's always trade-offs in policy design across different objectives. And I'm reminded of this scene from The Simpsons that I like, where this woman complains at the checkout that, I want everything in one bag, but I don't want the bag to be heavy. And I doubt that they had policy analysis in mind here, but I think an important function of model-based analysis is to really quantify those trade-offs. It's easy to pretend like trade-offs don't exist on one end, or maybe at the opposite end of the spectrum, to kind of opine on all of the qualitative factors that could matter without actually crunching the numbers. And maybe just to dig one level deeper on the question about fiscal costs, and this is one area where there was a lot of tension on display for the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a figure from a paper that Catherine Wolfram and I wrote on the Inflation Reduction Act, talking about its origins, policy gaps. And this is showing the cumulative fiscal costs over the next decade. So basically the cost of the government of the different energy provisions in IRA. And the two bars on the left show the initial government projections of the law's cost. When it came out in 2022 or was being debated, it was about $400 billion. To this day, when you have newspaper articles about IRA, it quotes that number that the US government produced, the Congressional Budget Office. But then, this value was updated over time. And I'm showing the 2024 estimate, which was basically double the initial cost. And if you really dig into, the CBO, score, or the estimate initially, they had sort of pulled numbers off the shelf from the US Energy Information Administration for, how many electric vehicles would be sold. And they multiplied the tax credit by that. That estimate was pretty low, basically suggesting that the number of vehicles sold in 2030 is even less than the number of vehicles that were sold in 2023. And you can contrast that with our paper in Science through 2031, and a lot of the models there are 2 to 3 times as high as that initial government estimate. And one of the conventions that's a little bit weird with the US government is that whenever they look at the fiscal impacts of this type of change, they're generally only looking out at the 10-year budget window. But policies tend to have longer run changes that are really important to quantify as well. And if you look at the bars to the right, just even out another 4 years, you can see that there's even higher fiscal costs. That's in part because the power sector tax credits under IRA, those extended not through a fixed date, but through until an emissions threshold was reached in the power sector, which potentially meant that the tax credits would continue for several years beyond the expiration of other sort of consumer facing credits. So anyway. That was maybe too in the weeds, but in terms of tax policy, I think this is the other really key figure. So climate policy instruments can have pretty significant fiscal impacts, both on the tax revenue side and on the government spending side. And so this figure comes from that EMF 37 paper, where each panel is showing trends over time by model. And again, these are for net zero policies that are implemented by auctioning permits. So it's cap and trade auctioning. So it's generating government revenue. And that revenue is shown in dark blue here. And I think one thing that really jumps out, if you just focus on the endpoint in 2050, the CO2 tax revenue is anywhere from 0.2 to 3.7% of GDP in 2050. And to put that range in context, the US tax revenue as a whole was about 12% of GDP in 2022. But one thing that's interesting is that as net zero is approached, the net revenues after subtracting subsidies for carbon removal, and that's shown in the dashed orange is the net impact, those are approaching zero as well. So you basically get this kind of inverted U-shaped curve for many models, where initially the net revenue goes up, but then as emissions are going toward zero, you're going towards zero on the revenue side. And that's definitely a challenge, right? If you're a government that initially is using the revenues from carbon policy to do useful things, and I guess Canada is a good example of using revenues. California as well, where I live, there's questions about how the rebates should be used potentially to incentivize clean energy investments, partially to offset sort of the distributional impacts that these policies might bring. But that is a challenge as you're reaching zero emissions. These revenues are also decreasing. And as you're reaching these deep decarbonization levels, as I mentioned, the carbon removal or CDR subsidy in light blue, that's increasing, which is like offsetting the revenues. And the magnitudes here, 0.1% to 3.6% of GDP, it's like pretty stunning compared to something like Medicare outlays in the US are about 3% of GDP in 2023. So again, the bottom line is that stringent climate policy can have pretty large fiscal impacts on both tax revenue and government spending. But the magnitudes here really depend on policy design. So if permits were freely distributed rather than auctioned, then government revenue would look pretty different. All right, so I want to wrap up. I'm going to skip. There are a couple slides here that I think relate to the study that important to think about affordability, and household affordability looks different from the government ledger. But just want to emphasize a couple high-level takeaways here. The first is that a combination of both policy design and assumptions about technology are really first-order drivers of these energy system outcomes as a consequence of policy impacts. And I think on one hand, this is a little bit unfortunate because both of these are fundamentally uncertain. But on the other hand, the probabilities of those different outcomes are really shaped by decisions that people can make today. So that's, I guess, both empowering and challenging from a decision analysis standpoint. I think the second one is that there's really strong regional differences in the energy systems evolution that can be masked either with national scenarios or if you're using global scenarios from say an integrated assessment model like you might see in an IPCC report, that definitely masks country-specific impacts. So we have a version of our region model for Canada, and I can say that the Canadian net zero pathways, they look very different from the US, look very different, depending on where you are in Canada. And then, finally, this idea that optionality helps to enable affordability is another one that I think is important, especially as we're thinking about policy design at the national level, subnational level. So the scenarios that have a bigger portfolio of technologies to have lower costs. But there are trade-offs to navigate between things like not just emissions reductions and costs, but also system resource adequacy and reliability, or effects on households. So yeah, I guess the final slide here is just that I want to emphasize that models that are used for policy analysis, some people often refer to them like maps, right? And just as different maps offer unique views of a city, whether that's the Tokyo subway map shown here, both the 2D form and then this cool 3D model. Energy models can be varied and complementary in the way that they offer insights on potential futures. They can help to guide those complex decisions, navigate uncertainties that are related to these policy relevant areas. But also, understanding their limitations and value are important as you sort of think through those policy and energy system decisions. So lots of links to the studies that you can download. And many of these are on our public website, which is at esca.epri.com. But yeah, want to thank you for your attention here and open the floor up for questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's do 10 minutes of questions. Anyone wants to raise questions here? So we have another student. Yes, Brian.
I have a question about modeling in general. I was wondering if it's possible to look at too many models. I remember in undergrad computer science, machine learning, there's this idea that you could add too many models to an ensemble in such a way that doesn't improve accuracy if they're making correlated errors and so on. I'm wondering if that's something you think about, or if it's sort of the more the better.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I often do think that some of these models or some of these studies maybe do have too many models. I won't single any models out here, but I think there's two factors that are really affect the optimal size of the study. I mean, one is simply logistical. The more models you have, the harder it is to make sure that you have very coordinated scenarios. Insist of the modelers that what they're reporting is an apples for apples comparison. And the EMF studies, those contain sometimes 10, 20, 30 models. And those are very difficult to really dig deep into questions. I published a lot of papers that look at a more limited number of models, like 3 or 4. And those are really insightful, especially since you are able to harmonize a lot more. I would also say that, yeah, you mentioned sort of the idea of correlated errors. Yeah, there's both the issue that some models are maybe not as well calibrated to some of the questions people are asking, but that doesn't mean that the modelers won't try to answer them anyway. And so that can be a difficult filter to interpret. I think my approach for multi-model study has mostly been to be inclusive. In EMF, that's kind of the spirit, is that anyone who wants to join can do it. But yeah, I've definitely run into cases where I wasn't as confident about some models' abilities to look at the questions. And that definitely makes a difficult situation when you're really trying to answer something rigorously. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
I want to follow up with a question and then we'll turn to them. Sorry. Actually, Stefan, why don't you go first? Yeah.
I just have a narrow specific question. Just based on something you commented about IRA, wondering, is there a part of that system of regulations that prevents the US government from just canceling the subsidies that are being offered to corporations?
Yeah, so I guess important context that I didn't go into that much detail on is that the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax credits that were set up, many of them were changed under the budget bill in 2025, especially for wind and solar in the power sector, and those consumer-facing incentives for heat pumps and electric vehicles. So, because they were passed through something called budget reconciliation in the U.S. legislative process, that means that in the future you just need a simple majority in order to change those credits. Now, it doesn't mean that you can cancel credits that have already been guaranteed, right? These production tax credits, you're supposed to receive them for 10 years. So that's still possible. But new projects, like a new wind farm that comes online next year, wouldn't be able to claim those subsidies. So I don't know if that was your question, that these can change because of the uniqueness of the budget reconciliation process.
So you're saying production credits are actually guaranteed? They can go on being paid. There's no way of canceling production tax credits?
Yeah, for projects that came online, say last year, that wanted to take the PTC, you get $1 per megawatt hour credit for 10 years, and that's something that I don't think can be taken away.
Okay.
There were some initial awards for other parts of IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law that offered funding for these hydrogen hubs. And that money has been taken away, including for the West Coast hubs. I think there's like court battles about whether that was legal or not, and we'll see how those end up turning out. But it does seem like, yeah, the projects that came online guaranteed these credits; those can't be taken away.
Let me ask you an overall question, John. How should we interpret your paper and the research you presented as policy evaluations? One, tell me whether this is correct. All of the models assume that we will get to net zero. And so it's a matter of, did the different policy we adopt will affect the abatement cost, the fiscal cost, the technologies chosen. And so we can evaluate these different policies according to those variables. Is that correct? Or are you not assuming that we will get to net zero? Because there are different emission reduction outcomes, right?
Yeah, that's so. These scenarios by construction assume that net zero by 2050 CO2 is reached, and it's through a cap and trade mechanism. And so, yeah, I mean, in the paper, you may have noticed that there was a figure that showed the sectoral CO2 reductions. So even though the economy is reaching net zero, that doesn't mean that every sector reaches net zero. And, especially in industry, right, that's one where the reductions are relatively shallow. And that's very different from the power sector where, the abatement costs are lower. And so, the power sector goes to zero, and with some models, potentially net negative emissions if you use bioenergy with CCS. So, yeah, I think the construction here is that you're reaching that target with a particular policy instrument. But yeah, you're able to look at these sectoral differences. You're able to look at differences in abatement costs because those did and do vary quite a bit across models.
So I could see that this being appealing to, for example, if I'm an investor and I believe that we will get to net zero in some way, should I be investing in CCUS or should I be investing in hydrogen? And then John's model says there's not much use for hydrogen. A lot of it's going to be CCUS. So I would bet on CCUS instead. And I would still continue to put money into gas. And so that's a kind of, it's useful for policy, it's useful for investment. But the big assumption that we will get to net zero is just, that's the starting point. That's the point of all this exercise, right?
Yeah, and I think, and this is a good question for my colleagues, Steve Rose and Claudia Octaviano, who think a lot about, climate transition risk, and EPRI is putting together a framework called it's called Smart Targets that's thinking about transition risks that companies face. And yeah, there, you are thinking implicitly or explicitly about, what is the probability attached to different policies obtaining, whether that's net zero, something, maybe less stringent or a different policy instrument. And so, yeah, if you're thinking about, should I make an investment in CCUS, you're implicitly with each one of these scenarios thinking like, okay, the probability of net zero, binding net zero targets, is that 10%? Is that 30%? Is that 50%? And then if you look at these different technology sensitivities that we saw earlier, you're also implicitly thinking about what is the probability associated with CCS being too expensive or not being available. And it all becomes pretty tricky quickly. Especially when you look at historical ability to forecast technological change. Solar, Greg Nemeth has a terrific book, How Solar Energy Became Cheap. There's a figure that has expert elicitations for people who are like in the solar industry and they were looking at 2030 costs in, I don't know, it's like the 2010 time frame. And a lot of those projections for 2030, something like 80 or 90% of them were above what we actually saw in like 2020, right? So they're overconfident and too high, systematically too high. But it's really hard to predict ex ante, where these costs may evolve moving forward for electrolysis with CCS. So yeah, it definitely makes things interesting, and also I think really underscores the importance of kind of an interdisciplinary approach to modeling and policy analysis.
More questions? Okay, that's Stefan. Yeah, maybe one last question.
Yeah. One more question. This is a bit niche, but I'm wondering what you know about the efficiency of natural carbon sequestration. Is that still being talked about a lot? And I noticed it was like on one of your very initial slides, and then it wasn't really mentioned throughout the rest of your presentation. Just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, you were probably thinking about this one. And whenever you're thinking about a portfolio of carbon removal options, the sort of non-technological removals are the natural climate solutions down below, and that includes things like afforestation. I think I mentioned biochar. Like several different things that people have already been using or are proposing to use, and this is something that I don't know if I have an emissions figure here. No, I don't. But with regen and our net zero scenarios, we do see that playing a role. I mean, already the sink in the US provides something like 800 million metric tons of sequestration per year. And there's questions about, with climate change, how might that change by itself? But that is an option to, basically enhance the carbon sink. And there's a really great paper by Pacific Northwest National Lab researchers that's thinking about, not just afforestation, but a greater range of, we'll call it non-technological carbon removal, these natural climate solutions. And those can play an important role. The extent to which they play a role, though, depends on land use considerations. Obviously, with these deep decarbonization scenarios, the land use is changing, right? With more wind and solar and transmission, and all of those things can influence the exact mix. But also the fact that if you're using bioenergy with carbon capture, that's land intensive, right? So yeah, anyway, that gets into these trade-offs, but we do see in our supply curves for afforestation that there is that is one of the important levers in reaching net zero.
And so I think the paper says this is part of the model. It's just that it's an unchanging model. It's a constant degree of natural sequestration, right?
Yeah, that was something for EMF, that the models that didn't have the ability to endogenously determine that, we said, okay, everyone's do 800 if you can, But regen, we do calculate that endogenously.
Okay. John, this is extremely helpful. I can imagine on myself, keep on trying to learn more things from you, but I think we should give you a break now. Thank you so much. Really grateful for your taking time to join us and explaining this material that's really complex, and we don't have a lot of experts who can do this. And so thank you again for doing this for us.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, great. I'll send the recording to you, and then you can tell us whether you're happy with it. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
That sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.